Northwoods, Wisconsin, 1908. Cold winds from Lake Superior swept across the scattered log farms nestled among the dark pine forests, carrying moisture and a bone-chilling cold that seeped into every crevice of the old wooden structures. In this land where winter always arrived earlier than forecasted and fiercer than human memory could recall, unpredictable blizzards and persistent ice storms had become the haunting fear of every family. High humidity meant that firewood left exposed to the wind for just one night would turn soft, heavy, and hard to ignite. Anyone who had lived here long enough knew that failing to keep firewood dry through the winter meant risking loss of heat, loss of home, even loss of life. Amid this setting, in a small 16 times 20-foot cabin standing alone on the edge of the forest, lived Evelyn Hargrove, a widowed elderly woman well past 70, frail in frame but still possessing the steady gait of someone who had faced blizzards her entire life. While every family in the area stacked their firewood outdoors and covered it temporarily with tarps, as they had done for years, Evelyn began something that made anyone who saw it pause and frown. She built a shed enclosing her entire cabin, as if draping the house in a second layer of wooden clothing. This was not the familiar kind of shed for storing tools or keeping potatoes. It hugged the cabin closely, running around all four sides, and from a distance looked like some bizarre structure whose purpose no one could fathom. Mockery quickly spread through the neighborhood. "A waste of wood," the men declared loudly as they passed by. "What does an old woman know about building?" A few women whispered behind her back. "Just caulking the walls would suffice. She's making a fool of herself." Others concluded as if they held the absolute truth. Yet despite the ridicule, Evelyn kept working diligently. Her aged hands trembled slightly as she lifted each plank, but her hammering was remarkably steady. She set each post, measured every distance with an old rope, then slowly erected the frame around the cabin, each piece of wood placed precisely without deviating even an inch. Villagers gathered to watch. Some stood with arms crossed, leaning against their sleds. Others shook their heads and walked away. A few curious children ran around observing, quietly mimicking the way she bent down to measure. No one believed this odd structure had any meaning beyond making the cabin look like a makeshift barn. But while they were still discussing it, the sky began to change color. From the direction of the lake, thick gray clouds gathered into long bands. The wind shifted unexpectedly and brought a colder bite than in previous days. A few people looked up and pulled their coats tighter around their necks, but no one paid much attention. Only Evelyn paused for a moment, her hand resting on a beam as if sensing something familiar. This winter would not be like the ones before, but no one in the neighborhood had yet realized it. Evelyn began her project with a design no one in the area had ever seen, a shed layer around the cabin, exactly 14 inches from the walls, enough to create an air buffer zone, but not so wide that wind would pool into cold pockets. Her cabin was small, just 16 times 20 feet, with weathered old wooden walls. So she knew that surviving the winter depended not on thicker walls, but on keeping wind and moisture out. She erected the first row of posts using 7-foot-long timbers, burying them 10 inches deep for stability. On top, she installed 8-foot horizontal braces, joined with simple mortise joints. The shed roof she made as a sloping overhang all around the cabin, with a pitch of 4 inches per foot, enough for wet snow to slide off without accumulating. The old 2-inch wide roofing boards were laid overlapping by 2 inches to prevent water from leaking into the buffer zone. Near the eaves, she left small 1-inch gaps running along the entire perimeter of the shed, just enough for warm air to escape gently, but not for strong winds to blow down and moisten the firewood. Below, she built a raised floor 9 inches high, supported by flat stones and old hardwood, completely isolating the firewood from the snowy, muddy ground. The construction progressed extremely slowly. Every detail was measured using the very rope her late husband had left behind. The rope still bore faded ink marks. 1 foot, 2 foot, 3 foot, half worn away, but she remembered each notch clearly. Her hands trembled lightly, but her actions were precise. Each time she drove in a 3-inch nail, she took a deep breath, then brought down the rusty hammer with just the right force. The sound of metal striking wood rang out evenly, slowly, but surely. Each 6-foot-long, 1 0-inch wide plank she dragged using a small sled with a rope tied around her waist. On windy days, She had to stop 3 or 4 times to readjust the rope, preventing the planks from being whipped sideways by gusts. Those passing by who witnessed the scene could not hide their surprise, mixed with mockery. For 3 weeks, the whispers never ceased throughout the neighborhood. How long will it take her alone? Until spring? Mr. Turner laughed loudly when he saw her struggling to pull a beam longer than her height. That shed wrapped around the cabin looks like a wrinkled skirt, one woman said while pointing, making the children burst into laughter. Those laughs did not stop Evelyn. Once the frame was up, she began stacking the firewood into the sections she had planned. A 3-foot section for birch kindling, a 5-foot larger one for oak that held heat, narrow ones for pine that burned bright. She stacked each type with exactly 2 inches between logs for air circulation, a habit she learned from her husband when he was alive. Then she rechecked every joint, every vent gap, standing in front of the shed at different times of day to feel the wind direction, strong westerly in the afternoon, easterly creeping in the morning. Based on that, she added 2 1/4-inch wide windbreaks on the north side, the coldest wind direction in the area. Finally, on a dull gray afternoon, the shed encircling the cabin was complete. It enveloped the house like a crooked wooden coat, patched together from countless reused planks, uneven in height. Passers-by stopped, looked, and shook their heads. Some laughed out loud, thinking it was no different from a makeshift shed. No one believed this strange structure had any value, but Evelyn, standing under the newly built shed roof, placed her hand on a beam and closed her eyes for a moment as if listening to something. To her, every measurement, every gap, every piece of wood held meaning, and winter would soon prove it. Evelyn understood that her structure was not just a few planks nailed together, but based on principles she had learned not from books, but from 70 years living in the Wisconsin woods, where wind, moisture, and snow each had their own rules and could kill if underestimated. In this climate, wind was always the enemy of heat and dryness. It carried moisture from the lake at average speeds of 20-35 miles per hour, with gusts exceeding 45 miles per hour in late fall. When cold, moist wind blew against wood, moisture would adhere in just 3-7 minutes, reducing the firewood's ignition ability by 30-50%. A bundle of firewood exposed to moist wind for one night could gain 12-18% in weight from absorbed water, rendering it nearly unburnable. That was why, when building the shed around the cabin, her primary goal was not adding another wall layer but creating a stable air buffer, the carefully measured 14-inch void. This distance was not random. If less than 10 inches, cold wind could penetrate with pressures up to 0.5 pounds per square inches. If more than 20 inches, swirling air in the buffer would trap moisture, slowing drying. At 14 inches, wind speed dropped by 70%. Moisture never reached the firewood, and the air in the zone warmed by an additional 24 degrees Fahrenheit, enough to prevent condensation on the wood surface. Strong winds lost momentum in the buffer, and the moisture they carried settled on the outer shed surface instead of soaking into the inner firewood. This deceleration mechanism made the shed act like a natural windbreak while maintaining ventilation. Air did not stagnate because she deliberately left 1-inch wide gaps continuous along the roof perimeter. At that width, escape velocity was about 0.81, 2 meters per second, just enough for moisture to vent out, but not large enough for strong winds to force back in. If wider than 1.5 inches, fine snow could enter. If narrower than 0.5 inches, moisture would be trapped, increasing firewood humidity by 1-2% daily. Those small measurements, distances she gauged with her old rope, were what kept the inner firewood below 18% moisture, the optimal level for winter burning. Wet snow was another factor she anticipated. Northwood snow could weigh up to 20 pounds per square foot when wet. If piled on the old cabin roof, the load could exceed 40% of the beam's strength, causing sagging or collapse. Her shed bore the full snow load. With a 4-inch per foot pitch, snow slid down the slope, retaining only 10-15% adhesion. The inner cabin bore almost no compressive force. The 14-inch buffer also prevented cold bridging, cold patches transmitting through the cabin walls, which could lower interior heat by 3-5 degrees Fahrenheit on windy nights. No one had taught her these things. She learned them by observing the forest trees. 3 5-foot pine branches always drooped to shed snow. Large tree trunks had rough outer bark protecting the dry inner layers. She also learned from watching her husband struggle with damp firewood. Times he spent 10 minutes kindling, only for flames to flare and die because the wood had absorbed wind moisture. She remembered his final words. "It's not the snow that kills you. It's damp firewood that lets the fire die." They became her guiding principle. As she entered the preparation phase, Evelyn sorted her firewood into 6 groups. Birch under 15% moisture for starting fires, oak for long 2-3 hour burns, pine for bright but quick flames, ash for steady heat, maple for damp nights, and a small stash of perfectly dry wood her husband had saved, reaching only 10-12% moisture. She stacked each type with 2 inches between logs for airflow. Inside the shed, she placed roof repair tools, 3-inch nails, a 2-pound hammer, 6 times 10-inch patching boards, a 20-foot rope coil, and a small shovel for clearing snow if a storm overloaded the roof. She also designed an 8-inch wide emergency exit on the south side in case the main door was blocked by snow. While neighbors relied on tarps capable of holding only 5-7 pounds of snow per square foot and prone to tearing in north winds over 30 miles per hour, Evelyn prepared every detail as if the worst storm of her life was coming. Because to her, winter never repeated itself. It only grew harder, and she no longer wanted to take any more chances. Early November, just as Evelyn finished her final preparations in the shed, the atmosphere over Northwoods began showing changes that only lifelong residents would notice. Atmospheric pressure dropped faster than usual, a heavy, moist feeling blanketing the entire forest. From Lake Superior, bands of cold moisture were pulled inland by northwest winds, threading through forest gaps and sweeping directly toward the small settlement where her cabin sat on the southern edge. Temperatures hovered around 30 degrees Fahrenheit, the exact threshold for freezing rain, a type far more dangerous to exposed firewood than snow. At first, everyone thought it was just a light early-season rain, but each drop hitting outdoor firewood instantly froze into a thin, clear ice layer. By midnight, the neighbor-trusted tarps began sagging under the heavy ice, edges forming sharp frozen ridges like blades. In just one short night, all the firewood stacks piled since September turned into glossy, solid blocks. When Mr. Turner tried splitting wood with an axe, the blade bounced back as if striking granite. Another tried burning a few small pieces, only to hear the hiss of evaporating water, and the fire died immediately. White smoke rose and curled around the stove mouth, signaling lost ignitability. Not just outdoor stacks suffered. Inside neighbor cabins, stoves began malfunctioning. As fires struggled to catch, steam from damp wood splattered the stove walls, creating irritating pops. Smoke seeped through chimneys, into bedrooms, lingering under old roofs. Many cabins developed a faint, acrid smell of improperly burned wood. Children coughed a few times, adults slammed doors harder against drafts, but no one felt true alarm. They saw it as a familiar early winter nuisance, believing a few sunny days would fix everything. But while most homes grappled with damp firewood, Evelyn's shed passed its first test almost perfectly. That morning, the old woman opened the shed door, stepped into the buffer zone where the air still held warmth from the stove burning overnight. She picked up a nearly 20-inch birch log, hearing the crisp, dry crack, a sound any cold region dweller knew meant zero moisture. The wood surface was so dry that when she ran her fingers over it, no thin frost adhered. She checked a few heavy oak logs and some quick-igniting pine. All were light, loose, and clean. Inside the shed, there was no sign the freezing rain had penetrated the night before. She smiled faintly, then opened her small notebook and wrote, "Last night's wind just stayed outside." Meanwhile, at nearby cabins, people stared at their firewood as if at bad news. Someone shook their head. "Just luck." Another said, "This freezing rain was weak. No need to brag." And the familiar line returned. "Wait for the big snow and see how long that shed lasts." None of them realized they had just witnessed the first signal, a mild test showing that the shed they had mocked throughout October was functioning exactly as Evelyn had intended, and winter had only begun. The early freezing rains were merely gentle warnings compared to what was quietly forming over Lake Superior. The second weekend of November, A mass of Canadian cold air plunged south at a speed that even seasoned local hunters stopped to stare at the sky. That frigid mass, carrying sub-zero temperatures and steel-sharp winds, met lingering warm lake moisture, creating a massive, humid vortex. In just 6 hours, pressure plummeted, water vapor rose in long, smoke-like streams, and winds escalated from 20 miles per hour to 40, then 65, strong enough to rip off barn roofs for families near the forest edge. Before residents could grasp what was coming, the storm formed in the rare superstorm pattern the Great Lakes region saw only once every few decades. That afternoon, wind screamed through the forest like metal grinding, not natural wind but a sharp, cold, pressurized howl. Snow appeared not in gentle flakes but in long horizontal sheets, driven sideways by gusts, whipping cabin walls like invisible fists. Temperature plunged from 28 degrees Fahrenheit to 5 degrees Fahrenheit overnight, freezing the ground so fast that water in porch buckets solidified in 30 minutes. All neighbor outdoor firewood stacks were encased in thick ice within an hour. By midnight, they were solid, inseparable, unsplittable, unusable blocks. Across the small village, cabins began to fall. Stoves extinguished repeatedly because damp wood refused to catch. Each kindling attempt produced only thick white smoke backing into homes. Children coughed, choking fits, eyes stinging from smoke. Adults frantically opened and closed doors, hoping outside gusts would push smoke out, but to no avail. Every cabin filled with the smell of half-burned wood and steam. The familiar scent of a winter failed at keeping firewood dry. In greater desperation, some families began burning indoor wooden items, chairs, cabinet doors, floorboards, anything that would burn, even briefly. In complete contrast to the chaos outside, Evelyn's cabin stood amid the storm like a small but steady beacon. The enclosing shed took the full wind force like a shield. Ice built 2-3 inches thick on the outer planks, heavy enough that some braces groaned faintly under gust pressure. But inside the shed, the wooden floor remained dry. Not a single drop had entered. The 14-inch buffer reduced wind speed so much that when she held her hand near a vent gap, she felt only a very gentle cold flow enough for circulation, but not strong enough to carry moisture in. Outside wind was so fierce it rattled the entire cabin frame. A few wall-hanging items shook as if touched. But inside her cabin, the fire burned steadily, flames unwavering, clean white smoke rising straight through the chimney without backing in like in other homes. The birch she kindled crackled brightly. Oak radiated even warmth as if no storm raged outside. The stark contrast between two worlds mere hundreds of feet apart created a chilling, painful image. From her window, through frosted glass, one could see a distant cabin. Black smoke forced inward, stove nearly dead, firelight flickering weakly as if surrendering. Meanwhile, warm glow from Evelyn's cabin faintly illuminated the shed roof, forming a thin halo amid the whipping whiteout. Her chimney smoke rose straight, clean, steady, the mark of dry, proper firewood, and a perfectly functioning stove. That superstorm night, as the Northwoods forest roared and other roofs began to sway, only the small cabin of the elderly widow stood firm, breathing evenly in a world crushed by wind. And that was only the beginning. The superstorm from Lake Superior did not just paralyze trails or freeze outdoor firewood stacks. It struck directly at what every family in the area depended on more than anything else: their heating systems. When firewood was damp, clear to the core, each time residents tried to start a fire, the moisture in the wood met reverse gusts and was forced back into the cabins as thick plumes of smoke. Chimneys, designed for less windy winters, began icing over at the openings. Just a few inches of ice was enough to block exhaust flow. When smoke could find no escape, it pushed downward, spreading into murky gray clouds that clung to ceilings and drifted down to where children slept. Within hours, temperatures inside many cabins dropped to life-threatening levels. Some places reached only 35 degrees Fahrenheit, with people's breath visible indoors as clearly as if they were outside. Children huddled in thick blankets, lips turning purple, breaths trembling. Mothers wrapped cloth scraps around their kids' heads to block drafts seeping through door cracks, though they knew it helped little. Adults took turns sitting close to dying stoves, trying to relight them in a hopeless cycle. In some cabins, within half an hour without heat, water in wash basins formed a skim of ice. All these signs showed they faced something far worse than a strong storm. In desperate attempts, a few men brought out axes to split frozen logs, but to no avail. Blades struck wood surfaces with a dull thunk like hitting stone. Many logs bounced back, forcing the wielder to step away. When they tried lifting a small pine log, it rang out sharply, like striking cold steel. No one mentioned tarps anymore. Everyone understood that thin covers, no matter how tightly stretched, could not withstand 65 miles per hour winds and ice layers forming in minutes. The methods they had long trusted, stacking firewood, covering it, building temporary shelters, suddenly held no value against this storm's power. Yet in Evelyn's cabin, the scene was entirely different. While winds howled outside, hurling clumps of snow like white knives, the old woman sat close to her stove, eyes narrowed in the warm golden light. She sewed a thick fabric patch with a long needle, stitches steady and rhythmic as if undisturbed by the gale. Her stove emitted no smoke. Flames burned cleanly, at just the right height, without flickering. The shed enclosing the cabin had reduced wind force so effectively that the firewood inside remained perfectly dry, burning clean without producing black smoke. The steady crackling pops were crisp, utterly unlike the choked sounds damp wood made. Occasionally she stood, opened the shed door, checked a long log, light, dry, with a clear ring. Then she returned inside, placing the log near the stove for later use. Her composure was not the calm of ignorance, but that of someone prepared for months, who had survived winters far crueler than this. Her face bore deep, weary lines, but her eyes were warm and steady, a peace no other cabin in the area possessed that stormy night. And that very contrast made the line between survival and despair sharper than ever. While many cabins sank into chaos from smoke and cold, as flickering flames died out amid winds shrieking through wooden walls, a faint knock sounded at Evelyn's door. She set down her needle, walked slowly over, and opened it a crack, only to see Harold Benton, the man who had mocked her most during the weeks she built the shed, standing shivering, holding his 3-year-old granddaughter. The child had nearly stopped crying, her face pale green, lips purple from cold, breaths weak and irregular. Harold could barely form words, his breath mingling with the storm, breaking into fragments. "Please, help us." The neighborhood's toughest man was reduced to pure desperation. Without reproach or questions, Evelyn opened the door wide, placed a hand on his shoulder, and led both inside. She immediately took several dry birch logs from the basket beside the stove and rekindled the fire it caught with a single match, crackling strongly, utterly unlike the sour sputter of damp wood. The little girl in Harold's arms suddenly cried as the first warmth touched her face, then burrowed into his chest, seeking human heat amid the encircling cold. Harold collapsed beside the stove, arms still clutching his granddaughter, shaking uncontrollably. But for the first time since the storm began, he exhaled like someone pulled from an abyss. In the minutes that followed, wind still lashed the walls, but another sound emerged. Heavy footsteps crunching through snow, groups of people appearing in the pitch-black night. Through the shed door crack, Evelyn saw a long line heading toward her cabin, hunched, hurried figures clutching heavy frozen firewood bundles or leading crying children chilled to the bone. Each cabin that lost its fire meant a family fighting to survive, and now all turned to the one place in the area still holding warmth. Her shed, the thing they had ridiculed for nearly a month, had become their last refuge. She opened the shed door to let them enter the buffer zone out of the wind, then brought them into the cabin one by one as space allowed. In the warm firelight, their expressions grew clear. Exhausted, confused, ashamed. An older man, still clutching a dripping damp bundle, burst into tears upon seeing the strong flames. He spoke as if confessing something long buried. I thought I'd never again hear firewood crackle in a storm like this. The steady pops from dry oak logs were simple yet powerful enough to pull him back to the feeling of survival. Others standing around could not hide their emotion. That sound they once took for granted had become proof of life. When the cabin filled with bodies, ragged breathing, and children's sobs, a strange silence fell. Wind still raged outside, but this place felt separated from the world. Then, in the flickering light, someone spoke not to justify but as a late admission. We were wrong. Many others nodded, heads bowed in shame. A few whispered softly, as if questioning themselves. How does her firewood stay dry? How did her shed withstand the wind? Those questions were not just for Evelyn, but for themselves, people who believed old experience was enough, that winter would not grow harsher. But reality laid it bare. In the worst storm night, only the mocked elderly widow kept fire, warmth, and hope for the entire neighborhood. As everyone still shivered around her stove, ragged breaths slowly steadying and confused looks turning to gratitude, Evelyn sat down beside the fire and began explaining in a low, slow but clear voice, as if the story had waited inside her for years. She had no formal training, no books on building or physics, but a lifetime in the Wisconsin woods had taught her things no classroom could. She said she could read the forest, watch wind shifts to predict incoming moisture, cloud colors to know when snow would whip sideways instead of falling straight, listen to wind through wall cracks to find where cabins lost heat. Wind, she said, kills fire and wets firewood faster than anything. Listeners fell completely silent. She recounted seeing, as a child, wooden walls soak up moisture like sponges after one damp, windy night. Firewood stacks thought dry rendered useless by a single gust. Everything she did today simply repeated what her eyes and ears had witnessed over 7 decades. Then she mentioned her husband, a moment that deepened the cabin's quiet. He died years ago in a similar blizzard when they lived farther south near the lake. That day their firewood had gone damp after 3 days of cold rain. They tried kindling, but flames would not catch, and wind backed down the chimney. He collapsed from cold just steps from the stove. Before his final breath, he grasped her hand and said words she never forgot. "Keep the fire dry. Keep wind away. You'll survive." Those words became her compass, and the shed around the cabin was how she honored them. But her husband was not her only teacher. She also learned from the Ojibwe people she lived near in her youth. They taught her to build wind deflectors from branches so cold air changed direction before reaching tents. They taught that surviving Great Lakes winters meant understanding wind, not just enduring it. She observed lake fishermen building double-layered smokehouses, an outer layer to block wind and driven rain, an inner to hold steady heat for drying fish. That principle, 2 protective layers, an air buffer she carried her whole life. All of it combined into the shed everyone once mocked. Now, amid the storm night, as stove warmth spread evenly and weathered faces began pinking up again, no one doubted anymore. They understood the elderly widow had done nothing eccentric. She had only done what life taught her, the only thing that kept a living flame in the year's coldest night. When Evelyn finished her life story, the cabin stove still burned steadily, but outside the wind had eased bit by bit. By the next morning, the storm finally dissipated. Winds down to about 15 miles per hour, still cold but no longer destructive. Residents gradually returned to their cabins to assess damage, and only then did the harsh truth emerge painfully clear. Firewood stacks thought well protected by tarps, lean-tos, or makeshift boards were now solid ice blocks. Many families quickly estimated 60–90% of their supply completely useless. Some logs frozen and split open, others saturated like sponges, many twice as heavy from absorbed water. Some cabins had only enough left for 2–3 days under normal conditions, not the dry, cold snaps or wet freezes that could strike any time in Northwoods. Plenty of families burned fences, doors, barn planks, or lesser furnishings to stay warm. Every face showed exhaustion mixed with bewilderment. They had believed old ways sufficient, this winter no different from past ones. The quiet warnings of the elderly widow mere folly. But when they visited Evelyn's cabin to thank her and learn, they witnessed a sight that left everyone speechless. Her entire firewood supply, every oak, every birch, every pine bundle remained perfectly dry, as if fresh from autumn sun. No moisture traces, no ice, no moldy smell. When she lifted a log and tapped it lightly, the clear crack made the group stare in stunned silence. One exclaimed, "How can it be this dry after 3 days of hell?" Evelyn did not boast, only said, "Wind couldn't get in, moisture couldn't get in. That's all." But people refused the simple answer. They wanted every detail. They asked eagerly, like former stubborn students now truly listening, how much space between cabin and shed? About 14 inches. What roof pitch for snow to slide without piling against walls? I made around 18 degrees. What boards do you use against moisture? Rough-cut pine, not sealed tight, so gentle air escapes. They memorized every word, without a trace of sarcasm. Those who once laughed at her, called her shed a wrinkled skirt, said she wasted wood, now stood quietly, eyes wide before knowledge they had scorned. Attitudes shifted unmistakably from mockery to curiosity, then genuine respect. No one said outright she was right, but the reverent silence was a stronger apology than words. In the weak post-storm sunlight, all understood one thing. The elderly widow's shed, once deemed odd, had become the most reliable solution Northwoods ever had. After seeing their own firewood nearly ruined while Evelyn's remained perfectly dry as if untouched by 3 days of hell, the entire Northwoods community entered the following spring transformed. As snow melted and March's characteristic muddy ground appeared, families began building their own sheds. Wealthier ones bought good milled pine, erected sturdy frames with 12 to 16-inch gaps around cabins exactly as she instructed. Poorer ones reused planks, old posts, even barn doors for smaller versions, but still following the wind buffer and moisture vent principles. The previous winter's lessons were too painful to forget, and no one wanted children again huddled around cold stoves. The town fire warden, who once warned Evelyn her shed might cause fires by storing wood too close, returned to inspect. He initially kept old concerns, but seeing her stone-divided sections, safe clearances, high roof vents, and separated wood zones, he changed instantly. Standing inside the shed, he took notes and declared to the learning crowd, "This system reduces house fire risk by 30–40% by keeping moisture away from wood and preventing smoke backdraft." Ben, those words spread as fast as winter wind, and he became the model's strongest advocate. Many families added creative variations. Most notably, the playfully named Evelyn Triple Slope Shed. 3-layered roofing for faster snow slide-off, enclosed walkways around cabins for total wind protection, and floors raised to 20 inches so wood never touched spring mud. Designs sprouted across Northwoods, but all rooted in the principle Evelyn proved through that brutal winter. By year's end, residents unanimously called the solution the Hargrove dry ring method, as a way to remember the once mocked elderly widow who alone kept flame alive in the region's worst storm night. Many years after the Hargrove dry ring became a familiar part of Northwood's life, Evelyn took her final breath in sleep at age 78. Beside her bed, the stove still burned steadily with dry logs from the shed she built alone with trembling but determined hands, the flame she never let die in her lifetime. When news of her passing spread, the community fell silent as if losing the guardian of their winters. They gathered around her cabin, once refuge in that terrible storm night. At the door, residents erected a small wooden plaque carved with simple yet profound words. She kept her fire dry and saved ours. No one objected. All knew it was not just gratitude but truth that had saved their lives. In later years, any new family moving to Northwoods was led by neighbors to Evelyn's old cabin to learn the principles. 14-inch gap, 18-degree pitch, vent gaps at board edges, wood zoning, tool hanging to avoid dampness. Children grew up seeing enclosed sheds as obvious, like cabins should never stand exposed to winter wind. To them, homes with surrounding sheds were standard, while bare-walled cabins were odd. Some Great Lakes engineers, studying her design later, described it in modern terms. Buffered thermal envelope, a wind-splitting, moisture-separating structure that universities only later textbooked. But in Northwood's memory, no scientific terms were needed. They simply knew the elderly widow long ago understood winter in a way books never taught. Winter returned, snow blanketing new shed roofs. From afar, cabins in the forest looked like glowing islands amid an icy sea, with encircling roofs catching falling layers, protecting dry firewood inside. Clean white smoke rose steadily from chimneys, just like Evelyn's cabin years before. In that cinematic scene, wind through pines made a long sound like retelling the past, and if a narrator's voice spoke, it would say what the region long understood. They laughed at her because they didn't understand. They only stopped laughing when their own fires needed her to survive. The shed stood year after year as the silent legacy of a small, elderly woman who changed an entire cold land by keeping what winter always tried to steal. A flame still burning. If you enjoy survival stories and life wisdom like this, please subscribe to the channel so you don't miss future episodes. Thank you for watching to the end. See you in the next journey.